Hey, welcome to HOA Karen Cases.
I've always believed ownership isn't emotional, it's procedural. The boat was tied exactly where I left it, registered, secured, documented. When the emails started, I didn't worry. Reminders, enforcement language, routine. Then a photograph arrived, my boat moving. Used while I was out of state, under community authorization. No one asked me. A routine stop changed that. Federal registration doesn't recognize assumptions. It recognizes names. Mine was on record. At the meeting, she said it was temporary, authorized, handled. But paperwork doesn't respond to tone. It responds to proof. The doc went silent. The tickets disappeared. Authority didn't argue. It withdrew. And the boat, it never moved again. Because ownership doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be documented. I've always believed ownership isn't emotional, it's procedural. The boat sat at the far end of the dock, bow angled toward the morning light, the way I always left it. The lines were tied cleanly, the cleats were wrapped the same way they had been for years. Nothing suggested movement, nothing suggested anyone else had touched it. I stood there longer than necessary, not admiring it, verifying it. Registration decals intact, hull number visible, lock secured. The small camera above the storage locker blinks its steady green light. I moved down the checklist out of habit, not doubt. I knew the condition already, but confirmation is different from assumption. The dock boards shifted slightly under my weight as I walked toward the ramp. The HOA sign was bolted to the railing, laminated and unremarkable. Private slips are for registered owners only. Unauthorized use subject to enforcement. The wording hadn't changed in years. It never needed to. Authority here was expressed. Through repetition, not volume, the HOA had always operated that way. Present, structured, manageable. I'd learned early that compliance kept things quiet. File paperwork on time. Respond when asked. Don't escalate what doesn't require escalation. Predictability preserves space. Inside the dockside storage box, I kept laminated copies of everything. Registration, insurance, emergency contacts. I flipped through them once, not because I expected a problem, but because I preferred certainty to memory. Then I returned them to their sleeve and closed the lid. The water was calm that morning. No wind pushing against the hull, no wake from passing traffic. The entire scene suggested stillness. It felt safe to leave. I was traveling for just over a week, long enough to matter, short enough to feel routine. Before driving out, I glanced at the community bulletin board near the parking lot. Notices were pinned neatly in rows, landscaping reminders, pool maintenance, and a printed email. Thread with a bold header, from Karen, HOA President. I didn't read it fully. I recognized her format immediately. Balanced margins, consistent tone, her name centered above the association logo. Her authority lived in presentation. We'd never had a direct conflict. Most of our interaction existed on paper. She didn't need to raise her voice. The system carried it for her. I loaded my bag into the car without thinking about her again. The drive out followed the same curve it always did, past identical mailboxes and trimmed hedges before opening onto the main road. I checked my mirrors once. The dock disappeared behind trees. At the airport, I sent a brief message to the neighbor across from my slip. Out for the week, just for awareness. Have a good trip, he replied. That was the extent of it. The first few days away were uneventful. Meetings that blurred together. Hotel rooms that felt interchangeable. Each night I cleared notifications without reading. Deeply. Weather alerts, routine emails, nothing that required attention. On the third night, an HOA message appeared. Community dock reminder. I opened it casually. The language was measured. A reminder about shared space compliance. A note about monitoring dock activity to ensure fairness and safety. It applied to everyone and no one at once. I didn't respond. There was nothing directed at me. Another followed the next day. Then another. Still general, still calm. The frequency registered, but not enough to concern me. HOAs moved in cycles. A complaint surfaced. Enforcement tightened briefly, then things returned to normal. That was my assumption. Late one evening, my phone buzzed with a text instead. Quick question, did you authorize dock use while you're away? I read it twice before answering. What do you mean? A pause. Never mind, probably nothing. Talk later. Distance makes things feel smaller. Hundreds of miles away, uncertainty flattens. I let it pass. That night, Karen's name appeared again in my inbox, replying to a group thread. All enforcement actions are being handled per HOA guidelines, she wrote. No individual resident is being singled out. The sentence stood out, though I couldn't have said why. There had been no accusation. I closed the phone and set it aside. There was no violation notice under my name. No demand, no escalation. I'd done everything required of me. Registration current, fees paid, slip assigned properly. Ownership should be quiet when it's maintained properly. Still, before bed, I checked my calendar, confirmed my return date, confirmed where I'd been on each day so far. It wasn't necessary, but reassurance rarely is. By the time I boarded my return flight, I was looking forward to the routine. The dock, the walk, the boat exactly where I'd left it. Nothing felt urgent enough to name. I believed the system was functioning. I believed documentation meant protection. And I believed that leaving something secured, registered, and accounted for meant it would remain exactly that until I came back for it. Distance reshapes urgency. 3 states away, information arrives flattened. Even concern feels abstract when you're standing in a hotel hallway instead of on your own dock. The first message came in without context. HOA put a notice on my windshield about dock use. I read it in an elevator, the doors sliding shut before I had time to think through it. Dock use wasn't unusual. Notices weren't unusual. The HOA had always preferred reminders to confrontation. I assumed it had nothing to do with me. Did they say what for? I replied. Unauthorized access, Karen's name is on it. Unauthorized access. To what? The dock? The ramp? Parking near a slip? It was vague enough to dismiss. Later that evening, a photo arrived. A notice tucked under a windshield wiper. HOA letterhead. Karen's signature printed cleanly at the bottom. I zoomed in on the date. It was from the day before. I knew exactly where I'd been. Seated in a conference room with no windows, listening to a presentation that ran long. I could account for the hour, the minute. The notice referenced dock-related violation. No slip number, no vessel listed, just a broad language. I saved the image. The next morning, an email chain appeared in my inbox. Karen had sent a message to the community about increased dock monitoring. She mentioned temporary measures to ensure compliance. Temporary measures? The phrasing felt deliberate, controlled. Residents replied asking what had changed. One asked whether the rules applied during an owner's absence. Karen responded quickly. All use has been authorized per HOA enforcement guidelines. Authorized. That word lingered. My name wasn't mentioned, but in one reply, someone referenced the far dock. My slip sat at the far end. Karen didn't address that directly. She reiterated policy instead. From a distance, it was still possible to rationalize. Enforcement cycles happened. A complaint surfaced. A reminder went out. Things settled. That afternoon, another text arrived. Did you give permission for anyone to use your boat? The wording was different now. Not a dock. Boat. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. No, I replied. Why? Just checking. There was some confusion earlier. What kind of confusion? A pause. Probably nothing. HOA stuff. Probably nothing. It offered closure without detail. I opened my calendar again, checked my flight confirmation, reviewed hotel receipts. Every reference date matched my absence exactly. There was no gray area. That night, more screenshots arrived from a group chat I wasn't part of. Fragments. Got ticketed. She said it was authorized. Dock under temporary oversight. Boat mentioned. I read each timestamp carefully. All of it occurred while I was away. I felt irritated at first, then restraint. Confrontation from 3 states away would accomplish nothing. I couldn't stand on the dock. I couldn't pull paperwork from storage. All I could do was preserve the sequence. So I started saving everything. Screenshots, email headers, message threads. I created a folder and labeled it by date. Karen continued replying in measured tones. She emphasized guidelines. She referenced enforcement authority. She reassured residents that no one was being singled out. She never addressed ownership directly. Late that night, a final message came through. The boat at your dock was mentioned in a warning today. The phrasing was subtle, detached, not your boat. The boat at your dock. When? I asked. Earlier? Who mentioned it? Karen. I set the phone down and let the room go quiet around me. If the boat had been referenced, it had been visible. If it had been visible, someone had decided it was relevant. And if it was relevant enough to be mentioned in warnings, then it had entered enforcement language. All while I was gone. I drafted an email to Karen, deleted it, drafted another, deleted that too. There wasn't enough clarity to confront, only implication. Before bed, I reviewed my return flight again. Confirmed the date, confirmed the time. The reassurance felt procedural. I wasn't afraid, but something no longer aligned. By morning, the uncertainty had shifted from irritation to calculation. If enforcement was occurring near my slip during my absence, and my boat was being referenced in warnings, then my name was orbiting something I hadn't seen. I zipped my suitcase and headed for the airport. Whatever was happening at the dock had already begun without me, and distance no longer softened it, it sharpened it. The image took a moment to load. I was standing near the rental car return, phone in one hand, keys in the other, watching the screen resolve from blur into detail. I expected another notice, another angle of laminated paper, something administrative. Instead, I recognized the bow immediately, the rail, the scuff near the cleat I'd never bothered to repair, the slight discoloration in the gel coat near the forward hatch. My boat. It was docked at an angle I would never have left, not dramatically off, just enough that anyone familiar with it would notice. The lines weren't tensioned properly. The stern sat wider than it should have. It looked tied by someone who understood the basics, but not the balance. I zoomed in. The water around the hull carried a faint disturbance. Not wind, wake, recent movement. This wasn't a still object photographed in place. It had been used. I felt the first real shift in my chest then. Not panic, not anger, recognition. I scrolled. The next photo showed two people on board. I didn't recognize either of them. They weren't neighbors. The dock community was small enough that unfamiliar faces stood out immediately. One leaned casually against the rail. The other stood near the console. They weren't hesitant. They weren't inspecting. They were operating. A third image followed. The boat underway, engine low, cutting a clean path across the water. No life jackets visible, no visible caution. Comfort. That was the detail that stayed with me. They weren't acting like they'd borrowed something fragile. They were acting like they'd been told it was permitted. I zoomed in again and looked for anything that would explain this without rewriting what I knew. A familiar jacket. A recognizable hat. Some indication I'd authorized it and forgotten. There was nothing. Each image carried a timestamp. Each timestamp fell within the days I had been away. I opened my travel app and checked my itinerary again. Then, my hotel. Confirmations. Then my calendar. The sequence aligned perfectly. I hadn't been there. The fourth image widened the frame, the dock, the ramp, and mounted clearly behind it, the HOA sign. Private slips are for registered owners only. The sign was fully visible in the shot. The language is unobstructed. This wasn't happening discreetly. It wasn't after-hours improvisation. It was happening in plain view, under posted rules that said it shouldn't. I sat down on a nearby bench and scrolled back through the photos more slowly. Registration decals were visible in one image, not readable at this distance, but unmistakable in placement and shape. The storage locker where I kept laminated documents appeared in the background. Nothing had been removed, nothing concealed. The boat was being used openly. A message appeared beneath the photos. Sorry to send this while you're away. I didn't know how else to explain it. Explain it to whom? When were these taken? I asked. Yesterday afternoon, and this morning. 2 separate days, 2 separate uses. This wasn't a single lapse, it was repetition. Did Karen say anything? I asked. Yes, she said it was authorized. Authorized. The word landed differently now that I could see what it referred to. I opened Karen's recent email again and reread it with the images in mind. temporary measures, authorized enforcement, community oversight. Abstract language suddenly had a physical reference point. I enlarged one image and studied the people on board again. They were steady, relaxed, unconcerned about being observed. That kind of posture doesn't come from improvisation. It comes from instruction. "Did anyone get ticketed?" I asked. "Yes, a few. One has already paid." "Paid for what?" I stood and moved away from the noise of the terminal, phone still in hand. If enforcement was occurring at the dock, and my boat was being used during that enforcement, then it wasn't incidental. It was part of the narrative, a visible reference, a physical anchor to justify authority. On paper, it would look clean. HOA, enforcing dock compliance, vessel present, activity authorized. Except, I hadn't authorized anything. I called the neighbor who sent the photos. "I didn't know how to phrase it," he said. "It just felt wrong." "Did you see who was operating it?" I asked. "Not clearly. Karen was down there earlier in the week, clipboard, talking to people. After that, it just started." We ended the call without resolution. Back home that night, I opened the photos again on a larger screen. I examined metadata, upload times, file orientation. The evidence was quiet but complete. I felt something settle in, not outrage, not fear, certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accidental borrowing. Someone had made a decision. Someone had treated my absence as flexibility. And someone believed that authority, phrased confidently enough, would cover the gap. I locked my phone and set it down. The problem wasn't that my boat had moved. The problem was that it had moved confidently. And confidence, when it isn't rooted in permission, leaves a record. These photographs weren't speculation. They were proof that something had already crossed a line. And once crossed, it doesn't return quietly. Karen's reply arrived at 9:12 a.m. Not early, not late, precisely within business hours, as if it had been scheduled. I opened it at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling beside me. The subject line read, "Dock activity inquiry, neutral, controlled." The first paragraph thanked me for reaching out and stated her intent to clarify the situation to prevent confusion. Confusion. There was no acknowledgement of photographs, no reference to my absence, just clarification. She continued, "Due to temporary operational needs within the community, the HOA authorized limited community use of certain dock-adjacent resources under Emergency Enforcement Authority." Dock-adjacent resources, not the boat, not the slip. Language wide enough to avoid naming what had actually moved. She followed with reassurance. At no point was any property placed at risk, and all activity was conducted in accordance with HOA enforcement guidelines. The sentence was declarative, final. She then addressed citations. The HOA did not issue enforcement actions directly related to your vessel. Any notices issued were a part of standard dock compliance procedures. I read that section twice. She hadn't denied use. She had denied direct connection. That distinction mattered. The email closed with an invitation to submit further concerns to the board for review. Not to her. To the board. Responsibility redistributed before it was requested. I set the phone down and let the room settle around me. Outside, wind moved lightly through the trees. Nothing in the environment suggested disruption, but the structure of the email did. It wasn't written to answer questions. It was written to preempt them. I pulled the binder from the shelf and opened it on the dining table. HOA bylaws, dock agreements, slip assignments. I turned to the section on emergency authority. The language was brief. It permitted temporary action to preserve safety or access during defined emergencies, fire, flood, structural hazard. Nothing about authorizing use of private property. Nothing about vessel operation. I highlighted the paragraph anyway. Then I opened the dock map. My slip was clearly labeled, assigned, not shared, no conditional notation. I photographed the page and saved it alongside the images of the boat. I returned to Karen's email. Temporary, emergency, authorized. Each word carried weight but avoided specifics. If authority had been properly exercised, there would be documentation attached. A declaration, a vote, a notice identifying scope. There was none. That afternoon, another message went out to the community. The language mirrored what she had sent me. Doc under temporary review. Enforcement conducted appropriately. Cooperation appreciated. Consistency. When repeated often enough, consistency reads as legitimacy. 2 neighbors texted me asking if everything had been handled. I didn't respond immediately. Handling suggests closure. There was no closure yet. That evening I drafted a reply to Karen. I did not authorize use of my vessel. Please provide documentation indicating otherwise. I stared at the sentence. It was factual, controlled. Then I deleted it. Her explanation had been positioned as sufficient. Responding impulsively would only extend her framing. Instead, I began organizing. Email headers, timestamps, photo metadata. I downloaded HOA notices from the portal and saved them locally. I printed the doc map and wrote the date in the margin. The process steadied me. Authority relies on clarity when challenged. If her explanation was accurate, it would hold under documentation. If it wasn't, silence would begin to form around it. I reread her email one final time. She had avoided naming the vessel, avoided naming the individuals on board, avoided naming the exact provision under which use was authorized. The email wasn't careless, it was calculated. Calculated to sound complete without becoming specific. Calculated to reassure without committing. I closed the binder and returned it to the shelf. There was no confrontation that night, no follow-up message. I allowed her explanation to remain intact. Because explanations that depend on tone tend to weaken when placed beside the record, and now the record has begun. I didn't reply to her email. That was deliberate. There's a reflex when authority speaks confidently. You answer quickly, clarify, correct. I felt the reflex rise and let it pass. Instead, I opened a browser and began reading. Not blogs, not forums, statutes, federal vessel registration guidance, operator liability definitions, jurisdictional limits. The language was dense and unadorned. It didn't interpret. It is defined. The registered owner is presumed responsible for vessel operation, unless formal transfer of control exists. Presumed. The word carried more weight than anything Karen had written. Presence didn't matter. Intent didn't matter. Convenience didn't matter. The name on the registration mattered. Mine. I printed the first section and placed it on the table. Then I retrieved my registration file and set it beside the printout. Hull identification number, registration number, expiration date, no ambiguity, no secondary operator listed, no temporary assignment, filed. I reread the inspection guidance for routine stops. If a vessel was involved in a violation while the owner was absent, the initial inquiry still centered on the registered owner. That wasn't optional. I leaned back in my chair and considered the photographs again. If something had gone wrong, collision, injury, damage, any report would have begun with my name. Not Karen's, not the board, mine. The system wasn't philosophical about it. It was procedural. Next, I opened the HOA bylaws again. Emergency authority, temporary measures, safety preservation. The language allowed restriction of access. It allowed coordination. It allowed signage. It did not grant authority to operate or authorize operation of private vessels. The distinction was narrow, but clear. I underlined the section and dated it in the margin. Then I drove to the marina office and requested a copy of their incident protocol for inspectors. The clerk handed it to me without comment. The scenarios listed were practical. Unauthorized use, false representation of permission, disputed control. Each ended the same way. Registration identified first. I drove home more slowly than usual. The dock appeared unchanged. The boat sat where it had been retired, calm, balanced, corrected. It looked harmless. That was the danger. Liability doesn't announce itself. It waits for a trigger. Inside, I laid everything out across the dining table. Registration, federal guidance, HOA, bylaws, photographs, Karen's email. Side by side, the separation was obvious. Karen's explanation existed entirely inside HOA language. Federal registration did not recognize HOA language. There was no intersection point. I began drafting a letter. Not emotional, not accusatory. A request. Please provide documentation authorizing the use of my federally registered vessel during the dates of my absence. Please provide the emergency declaration or board resolution under which such use was permitted. Please identify the individuals who operated the vessel. I cited registration numbers and dates. I referenced statutes without commentary. When I finished, I read it once aloud. It sounded restrained, direct. I printed 2 copies and signed both. One for the HOA, one for the binder. At the post office, I sent it a certified return receipt. I watched the clerk stamp the envelope and slide it into the outgoing bin. The tracking slip went into my wallet. On the drive home, I thought about what I'd done. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't escalated publicly. I had simply moved the issue from explanation to documentation. That shift changes everything. Back at the house, I placed the duplicate letter behind the registration copy in the binder and labeled the section Inquiry. Then I waited. Because when documentation is requested and it doesn't exist, silence begins to form around the absence. And silence, in that context, says more than any email ever could. I noticed the change before anyone said it aloud. It wasn't dramatic. No arguments, no visible conflict at the dock. Just longer pauses when I walked past. Conversations that lowered a notch. People watching the ramp instead of stepping onto it. The boat hadn't moved, but the tone around it had. The first neighbor approached me near the edge of the dock. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He pulled a folded notice from his pocket and handed it to me. HOA letterhead. Karen's signature. A fine for unauthorized dock activity. "I parked near your slip for a few minutes," he said. "Unloaded tools. Come back to this." I looked at the date. It fell squarely within the days I had been out of town. "Did anyone explain it?" I asked. Karen said it was part of temporary enforcement, that it wasn't personal. He didn't sound angry, just unsettled. "Did she mention the boat?" I asked. He hesitated. "She said something about activity near your dock." Near. That distinction mattered. I handed the notice back. "Did you pay for it?" He nodded. "Didn't want it to escalate." I watched him walk away, shoulders slightly rounded, as if relieved to have passed the question on to someone else. Later that afternoon, another neighbor stopped me near the parking area. "I got a warning," she said. "No fine yet, but it mentioned unauthorized access tied to enforcement." "Tied to what?" I asked. She lowered her voice. "She referenced your boat, said it was under review." Under review. The phrase had become common. "I didn't authorize anything," I said. Her posture shifted when I said that, subtle but visible. "That's what I thought," she replied. By evening, I'd had 4 variations of the same conversation. Ticket issued, warning posted, dock under temporary oversight, boat referenced indirectly. Each person had accepted the explanation at the time, not because it made complete sense, but because it had been delivered calmly. I didn't contradict anyone. I didn't share what I'd filed or what I'd requested. I listened. Patterns surface more clearly when you don't interrupt them. The enforcement had clustered around my absence. The language used by Karen had been consistent. Temporary authority, oversight, compliance review. The ticket stopped abruptly once questions began circulating. That was noticeable. The next morning, I ran into an older resident near the mailboxes. "Did they really use your boat?" he asked directly. "Yes," I said. He nodded once. Didn't seem right. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. By midday, people weren't asking whether enforcement had occurred. They were asking whether it could. "Can they authorize that?" someone asked me quietly. "I don't know yet," I said. "I'm waiting on documentation." That answer changed the conversation. Waiting on documentation implied something different than waiting on explanation. The dock remained quiet. Fewer people lingered. No one tied up near my slip. Karen was nowhere visible. No clipboard, no inspections, no visible enforcement. That absence didn't go unnoticed. That afternoon, a couple approached me together. "We paid," one of them said. "Just to avoid complications?" "What were you told?" I asked. "That it was better to comply," she said. "That challenging it would create more issues." I nodded. Authority often functions on that assumption. It doesn't require force, it requires fatigue. That night, I wrote down what I'd heard. not names, just dates, phrases, amounts, temporary oversight, authorized use, better to comply. Each entry went into the binder under a new tab, accounts. I wasn't building a case against neighbors. I was mapping how the narrative had spread. The following day, I passed 2 residents standing near the ramp. They stopped talking when I approached. Then one of them stepped forward. "We didn't know what to believe," he said. Everything sounded official. "It was formatted that way," I replied. He exhaled slowly. That's what made it convincing. Convincing. That word stayed with me. Authority doesn't need to be correct to be convincing. It needs to sound settled. As the week went on, something subtle shifted. Neighbors stopped accepting short answers. They started asking for clarification, not aggressively, just directly. Where is the vote authorizing this? What emergency triggered it? Why weren't the owners notified? The questions weren't coming from me. They were coming from people who had paid fines they now weren't sure had a basis. Karen's silence grew more visible with each passing day. Enforcement halted, no new notices, no follow-ups. The dock felt suspended, not officially closed, but paused. I sat on my porch that evening, listening to the quiet settle over the street. The absence of activity carried more weight than the activity ever had. What unsettled people wasn't the fine. It was the realization that the fine might not have been grounded in authority at all. Compliance had felt safer than confrontation. Until documentation entered the conversation, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt aware of how quickly rules expand when no one tests them, how easily authority extends into gray space when people are tired enough not to question it. The neighbors hadn't started asking because I demanded it. They started asking because the explanation no longer aligned with what they were seeing. And once alignment fractures, it doesn't repair itself quietly. It widens. The dock remained still, but the questions had begun moving, and they weren't moving under Karen's direction anymore. Certainty doesn't arrive loudly. It settles. I reached it at the dining table on a Tuesday morning, laptop open, house quiet. The Federal Vessel Registration Database is not designed to persuade anyone. It doesn't explain, it doesn't frame, it records. I entered the hull identification number from memory, checking each character before submitting. The record appeared instantly. Owner, my name. Address, my address. Status, active. No secondary operator, no temporary assignment, no shared authority. I let the screen sit there longer than necessary. This wasn't interpretive, it wasn't contextual. It didn't care about explanations or tone. It identified responsibility. I downloaded the full record and printed a copy. The paper landed flat on the table. I placed my original registration beside it. Everything aligned. Hull markings in the photographs matched the record. Decal placement matched. Dimensions matched. There was no room for ambiguity. If the vessel had been operated, it had been operated under my registration. I reopened the federal guidance I'd read earlier. The registered owner is presumed responsible for operation unless documented transfer of control exists. Presumed. That word narrowed the situation. The burden wouldn't begin with proof of innocence. It would begin with my name attached to a report. I imagined the sequence if something had gone wrong. Inspection, citation. The operator questioned, registration run. My name appears on a screen. The individuals on board could reference community authorization all they wanted. The database wouldn't recognize that phrase. It would recognize registration. I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment. The issue was no longer philosophical. It was structural. HOA, authority-governed docks. Federal registration-governed vessels. Those jurisdictions did not overlap. I reopened the binder and placed the printed registration at the front of a new section labeled Federal, then drafted another letter. Not emotional, not reactive, formal. I addressed it to the HOA office. I referenced the registration number. I referenced the dates of operation shown in the photographs. I requested documentation authorizing use of the vessel during my absence. I asked for the specific board action or emergency declaration under which such use had been permitted. I requested identification of the individuals who had operated it. I did not accuse. I did not speculate. I requested records. When I finished, I read it once, checking the tone. It was restrained, procedural. I printed 2 copies and signed them in blue ink. One went into the binder, the other into an envelope. At the post office, I chose certified mail again. The clerk stamped it without looking up. The green receipt was handed back to me. I folded it and placed it in my wallet. On the drive home, I passed the HOA sign at the entrance to the community. Fresh paint, clean lines, authority expressed through presentation. I thought about how easily presentation substitutes for jurisdiction when no one looks beyond it. Inside the house, I added the tracking number to my timeline and noted the delivery date. Then I waited. No follow-up email arrived. No clarification from Karen. The portal showed no acknowledgement of receipt, but the tracking number confirmed delivery. Silence followed. This silence felt different from before. Not confident, not measured, delayed. The registration had done what it was designed to do. It anchored responsibility in one place, and that anchor did not recognize HOA language. The next few days passed without visible activity at the dock. No new notices, no clipboard inspections. The boat remained tied correctly, unmoving, but the alignment had shifted. Authority had been asked to produce documentation that either existed or did not. There was no tone that could substitute for it. I didn't follow up. Time clarifies absence better than confrontation. By the end of the week, the situation no longer felt uncertain. It felt inevitable. Either documentation would surface, or silence would confirm what I already knew. The registration had tied everything together, and once tied, it couldn't be untied with reassurance. It would hold until someone addressed it directly, in writing, with proof. The silence arrived all at once. For weeks, my mornings had begun the same way. HOA emails, forwarded questions, neighbors checking in. Then suddenly, nothing. No reminders, no updates, no clarifications. I refreshed my inbox twice before accepting it. I walked down to the dock just after lunch. A new sign had been taped at the ramp. Dock closed, under review. No letterhead, no citation of authority, no end date. The language was stripped down, defensive. They weren't enforcing anymore. They were contained. By mid-afternoon, neighbors began mentioning it quietly. No more tickets, someone said. Karen hasn't been down there, another added. The enforcement machine that had operated so steadily during my absence had stopped without explanation. That told its own story. I checked the tracking number for my certified letter. Delivered, signed for. Still no response. When documentation is requested and it doesn't exist, momentum stalls. That evening, a neighbor called. They told us not to use the dock until further notice, she said. Email came from the board account, not Karen. That distinction mattered. Her name had disappeared from communication. The next morning, the HOA portal updated. Violation entries marked void. Payments labeled pending refund. No commentary attached, just status changes, quiet reversals. I stood at the window and watched the dock from a distance. No one approached it. The sign fluttered slightly in the wind. The boat remained still. Authorities that had spoken confidently days earlier had withdrawn into administrative edits. By the third day, another sign appeared. Dock access suspended pending external review. External. That word confirmed what no one had said out loud. The issue had moved beyond internal framing. Neighbors began speaking more cautiously. Does this mean someone filed something? Is this about jurisdiction? Are we exposed? I kept my responses measured. I asked for a documentation. I filed for clarification. That's all. They didn't need more than that. The refunds began landing in accounts quietly. No apology attached. No acknowledgement of error. Just transactions reversed. Money corrects paperwork. It doesn't correct awareness. The dock remained closed. Karen remained silent. Her absence had become visible. No emails in her name. No in-person presence. No clarifying statement. Silence in this context wasn't calm. It was pressure without release. Late one evening, I completed the final step I'd been considering. I filed a formal inquiry with the Maritime Authority. Not an accusation, not a complaint framed emotionally. A clarification request. I listed the registration number. Attached are the photographs. included the dates of operation during my absence, referenced the HOA's claims of authorization. I asked one question: what liability attaches to registered ownership under these circumstances? When I submitted it, there was no dramatic confirmation, just a reference number and automated acknowledgement. Procedure had begun. The following morning, the dock lights shut off at sunrise as usual. The sign remained taped to the railing. Neighbors avoided lingering near it. Authority, once confident, had retreated into ambiguity. And ambiguity makes people cautious. On the 5th day of silence, I received a brief email from the Maritime Authority confirming review of my submission. No conclusions, no timeline, just acknowledgement. That acknowledgement changed the atmosphere more than any announcement could have. Within hours, refund confirmations multiplied. The portal updated again. Enforcement language removed entirely. The board issued a short statement. Dock governance under compliance review. No further explanation. The silence was no longer empty. It was defensive. I sat on the porch that night and listened to the neighborhood settle. No raised voices, no visible conflict. Just an awareness that something structural had been tested and found thinner than expected. Karen still hadn't spoken. Authority had stepped back from language it could no longer support. The dock remained closed, the boat remained tied. Nothing dramatic had happened, and that was precisely the point. Panic, in administrative spaces, doesn't look frantic. It looks like edits. It looks like a refund. It looks like silence where confidence used to be. And once silence replaces explanation, control has already shifted. The call came in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. No urgency, no warning. Just my phone vibrating on the desk while sunlight shifted slowly across the wall. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't saved. The area code was unfamiliar. I answered anyway. Is this the registered owner of the vessel bearing registration number ending in 37? Yes, I said. This is Officer Daniels with the Coast Guard. I'm calling regarding a routine inspection conducted earlier today. Routine. That word settled differently than any accusation could have. He explained it calmly. The vessel had been stopped during standard patrol. Documentation requested, identification verified. No emergency, no complaints, just inspection. There was a discrepancy, he said. The listed operator did not match the registered owner. We're reconciling usage with registration. I stood and walked toward the window without realizing I'd moved. When was the stop? I asked. Approximately 10:40 this morning. And who was operating it? 2 individuals who stated they were authorized under Community Enforcement Authority. However, no documentation supporting that authorization was produced. Community Enforcement Authority. The phrase sounded smaller outside of HOA emails. I wasn't present, I said. I've been out of town. Yes, he replied. We've noted your travel records. This is not punitive. It's procedural. Procedural. The word appeared again, but this time from a system that didn't rely on formatting. There are no citations issued at this time, he continued. We're finalizing the inspection report. You may be contacted for clarification. Clarification, not justification, not negotiation, just alignment. Am I facing any violation? I asked. No, he said. We're establishing record consistency. The call ended without tension. No raised voices, no urgency. I remained standing by. The window for a moment after the line went quiet. The significance wasn't emotional. It was structural. My name had surfaced in a federal system during use I had not authorized. That shift couldn't be reframed as confusion. It was documented. An email followed within the hour. Case reference number, summary of inspection, confirmation of ownership verification. No narrative, just record. By early evening, neighbors were texting. Heard there was a stop. Is everything okay? Was it serious? I answered each one the same way. It was routine. I'm cooperating. That was true. It was also incomplete. I walked down to the dock that night. The sign still read, Dock access suspended pending review. The boat was tied properly, lines neat, engine quiet. From a distance it looked harmless, but the context had changed. This wasn't internal enforcement anymore. The next morning, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. No agenda attached, no explanation provided, just Attendance requested. That timing was not coincidental. The stop hadn't introduced chaos. It had introduced jurisdiction. I spent the morning organizing documents again. Registration copy, photographs, HOA correspondence, certified letter receipt, Coast Guard acknowledgement. I didn't rehearse anything. Facts don't require rehearsal. As I closed the binder, I understood what had shifted. The stop mattered not because it was dramatic. It mattered because it was ordinary. Routine enforcement doesn't bend for HOA language. It checks registration. And once registration surfaces in the wrong context, tone becomes irrelevant. By the time I locked my door and headed toward the meeting, the balance had already changed. Whatever Karen intended to say that evening would now exist beside a federal inspection report. And federal inspection reports do not negotiate with reassurance. They record. The boat hadn't moved far, but the situation had. Quietly, decisively, and without anyone raising their voice. The meeting notice went out less than 12 hours after the call. Emergency HOA meeting. Attendance requested. No agenda, no attachments, no framing. I arrived early. The community room was already set. Folding chairs in close rows, board table at the front, microphones resting in place but not yet powered. The space felt prepared, but not planned. I took a seat near the center aisle and placed the binder on my lap, closed. Neighbors filtered in quietly. The conversations were low, brief. No one seemed certain what would be addressed, but everyone understood why we were there. Karen entered last. No clipboard this time, no printed notices. She walked in composed, posture straight, expression neutral. She took her seat at the center of the board table and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you for coming," she began. "I want to address recent developments and clear up confusion." Confusion. She described the Coast Guard stop as routine, emphasized that no violations had been issued, repeated that the HOA had acted in good faith to manage dock access during a temporary review period. She did not mention my absence. She did not mention registration. She did not mention refunds already marked pending. "As of now," she said, "there is no cause for concern. The board is cooperating fully." The room was quiet, but not convinced. A man in the second row raised his hand. "Why were tickets issued if use was authorized?" Karen's answer was measured. "The notices were part of broader dock compliance enforcement," she said. "They were not tied to a specific vessel." Murmurs followed. Another resident asked, "Who authorized the use?" "The board exercised emergency authority," she replied. The word emergency hung in the room. No one spoke for a moment. I stood. Karen's eyes shifted toward me briefly, then returned to the room. "Yes," she said. I didn't approach the front. I remained where I stood and placed the binder on the empty chair beside me, opening it carefully. "I'd like to clarify the sequence," I said, "not interpretation." The room settled. I removed the registration copy first. "This is my federal vessel registration," I said. "It identifies me as the registered owner and operator." I placed it on the table near the aisle. Next, the photographs. These images were taken while I was out of state. Then the Coast Guard acknowledgement. "This confirms a routine inspection during use I did not authorize." I paused. I sent a certified request asking the HOA to provide documentation authorizing operation of my vessel. I have not received that documentation. The word operation shifted the focus. Karen leaned forward. "We did not authorize the operation," she said quickly. "Only access." I turned a page in the binder. "The individuals operating the vessel stated they were acting under community authorization," I said. "That statement appears in the inspection. Record." Silence. The questions that followed were no longer abstract. If something had happened, who would have been liable? Why were refunds issued without explanation? Was there a formal vote? Karen's responses were shortened. "We acted within our understanding of authority. We are reviewing procedures. We're cooperating with external inquiries." External. She still avoided naming the agency. The center of the room had shifted. This was no longer about dock compliance. It was about exposure. After several more exchanges, Karen moved to adjourn. "The board recommends patience while matters are reviewed," she said. No vote was taken. No resolution adopted. The meeting ended without applause, without argument, just quiet recognition. As people stood and began to leave, a neighbor stopped beside me. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being precise." Precise. That word stayed with me as I closed the binder. Karen remained seated at the front table after most of the room had emptied. She spoke quietly with another board member, posture still controlled. But control had narrowed. She had entered expecting to frame the narrative. Instead, the record had framed it for her. There had been no confrontation, no raised voices, just documentation placed in the center of the room. And once documentation enters a space like that, authority has to respond to it, not rephrase it. As I stepped outside into the night air, I understood something clearly. The meeting hadn't resolved anything, but it had changed ownership of the room. Karen no longer spoke unchallenged, and authority, once required to answer to record, is never quite the same again. The report arrived early. No warning, no introduction, just an email with a PDF attached and a subject line made of reference numbers. I opened it at the kitchen table. Federal paperwork doesn't explain itself. It establishes a record. The first page listed the basics: date of inspection, location, vessel identification, registered owner. My name appeared once, precisely placed. Then the findings: unauthorized use of a registered vessel during owner absence, false representation of authority by third parties, improper enforcement actions outside jurisdictional scope. Each line stood on its own, no commentary, no interpretation, just determination. I read it twice before setting it down. The next section addressed jurisdiction directly. HOA authority acknowledged in limited terms, dock management, signage, slip allocation. Authority explicitly excluded from vessel operation, authorization, or representation of ownership rights. The distinction was written plainly. There was no overlap. I printed 2 copies. One went into the binder behind the registration. The other I kept on the table for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't vindication. It was an alignment. By mid-morning, the information had already begun circulating. A neighbor texted, "Is it true they couldn't authorize it?" "Yes," I replied. "It's in writing." The HOA portal updated that afternoon. Dock enforcement suspended pending compliance review with external authorities. The phrasing was careful, suspended, not paused. Karen's name did not appear on the notice. Communication shifted entirely to the board account. Later that day, a courier envelope arrived. Inside was a single page from legal counsel. "We acknowledge receipt of your correspondence and the referenced report. The association is reviewing the matter and will respond as appropriate. No denial, no defense, no clarification, acknowledgement." I placed the letter beside the federal report and compared the tone. One document was resolved, the other deferred. The following evening, another HOA notice appeared online. Effective immediately, all prior dock-related enforcement actions are rescinded, resigned. The word carried more weight than any apology would have. Refunds processed, violations voided, portal entries erased. No explanation accompanied them. No statement of error, just administrative reversal. Karen did not address the community. Her absence was now structural, not temporary. Within weeks, the board minutes recorded a single line: resignation accepted. No elaboration, no defense, no statement from her. Authority had withdrawn quietly. I filed the resignation notice behind the report and closed the binder. There had been no dramatic collapse, no confrontation beyond the meeting, no public reckoning, just jurisdiction meeting boundaries. The dock reopened gradually, signs removed, enforcement language rewritten in the amended charter, emergency authority narrowed, procedural requirements added. Nothing referenced what had triggered the revision, but everyone understood. I walked down to the dock that evening. The boat sat as it always had, balanced, secured, unmoving. From a distance, nothing looked different, but the structure around it had changed. Authority had encountered a system larger than itself, and when it did, it didn't argue. It was adjusted. I leaned against the railing and watched the water reflect the fading light. Federal paperwork does not escalate. It does not debate. It records. And once recorded, it draws a line that tone cannot cross. Karen had relied on language. The report relied on statute. Only one of those holds when examined. I returned home, placed the binder back on the shelf, and left it there. The issue no longer required explanation. It existed where it belonged. On the record. And that was enough. The reversal came without announcement. I saw it first as a status change. Where violation numbers had once appeared in bold red, the portal now displayed a single word beside each entry. Void. No explanation, no summary of findings. Just administrative removal. My phone began to buzz shortly after. They voided mine. Refund just hit. Got an email, no details. The refunds moved quickly, efficiently, as if the system had always known how to reverse itself. The email from the board was brief. All prior doc-related enforcement actions have been rescinded. Refunds are being processed. We appreciate your patience. Patience. No acknowledgement of overreach. No clarification of authority. No apology. I closed the laptop and stepped outside. The dock looked unchanged. The boat rested where it had been returned, lines steady, hull clean. The sign restricting access remained for now, but the tone around it had softened. No one lingered near it. People passed quietly, glancing, once before moving on. That afternoon, a neighbor approached me near the end of the dock. "We got the money back," she said. "Feels strange." "How so?" I asked. "It's like it didn't happen, but it did." She wasn't asking for an explanation. She was acknowledging something larger. Money can undo a transaction. It cannot undo awareness. Over the next few days, conversations shifted. No one spoke about Karen directly. They spoke about procedure. What exactly counts as emergency authority? Why wasn't there a vote? How do we know next time? The tone was no longer deferential. I was cautious. At the next routine HOA meeting, the agenda included amendments to enforcement language. Emergency authority narrowed. Requirements for formal notice added. Appeals process clarified. No reference was made to why the revisions were necessary. No one asked. The room understood. Afterward, I walked home as evening settled over the street. Porch lights came on. Car doors closed. Life resumed its usual rhythm. Nothing looked damaged. That was the unsettling part. There were no dents in the boat, no marks on the dock, no visible evidence of weeks of uncertainty. The damage had been procedural, trust stretched thin, compliance extracted without full authority, silence mistaken for agreement. Those things don't leave visible scars, they leave memories. Later that week, I added the final refund confirmations to the binder and closed it. The record was complete. Photographs, emails, inspection report, rescinded violations, a full arc documented. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt clarity. Undoing damage quietly is still a correction, but correction doesn't erase what it revealed. It simply restores alignment. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the dock lights reflect off the water again. The boat remained still. The ramp opens, no signage, no warnings. Everything had returned to its prior state, except it hadn't. The difference was invisible but structural. Authority would be read differently now. Questions would surface sooner. Documentation would be requested before compliance, not loudly, just carefully. As the night settled in, I understood something with steadier certainty than before. Nothing dramatic had happened. No confrontation beyond what was necessary. No escalation beyond record. And yet, something foundational had shifted. The system hadn't collapsed. It has been corrected, quietly. And that kind of correction lasts longer than any announcement ever could. The resignation appeared as a single line in the monthly board summary. No headline, no announcement, no acknowledgement. Karen Fisher has submitted her resignation, effective immediately. That was it. The paragraph moved on to budget approvals and landscaping updates without pause. I read the sentence twice, waiting for context that didn't arrive. There was none. After weeks of formal language, emergency meetings, and external review, her exit was administrative, clean. Neighbors mentioned it in passing. "Did you see? Guess that's that." Feels abrupt. But no one seemed surprised. Her absence had been forming long before the sentence appeared in the minutes. First, her name disappeared from emails. Then her voice was replaced by the board account. Then her presence at meetings narrowed. By the time the resignation was recorded, she had already stepped back. Still, something lingered. There had been no explanation, no acknowledgement of the enforcement actions that were rescinded, no statement addressing the use of a registered vessel without permission, no apology, not to me, not to the residents who paid fines, not to the community whose authority had overextended itself. Silence had become her final message. Perhaps that was intentional. Explanations require ownership. Ownership requires admission. And admission invites record. A few days after the resignation, the board circulated an amended charter. The changes were precise. Emergency authority narrowed to define safety events. Temporary access modifications required majority board approval. Owner notification mandated for any enforcement action involving private property. Appeal procedures formalized. The document did not reference why those changes were necessary. It didn't need to. The residents who had lived through the enforcement period understood exactly what had prompted them. I ran into a neighbor near the lake trail one evening. "She just left," he said. No defense, no statement. "What would she have said?" I asked. He considered that. Something. But sometimes silence is the only position left. Karen had relied on structure, on tone, on the assumption that compliance would outpace scrutiny. When scrutiny arrived in the form of federal documentation, the structure didn't collapse dramatically. It receded. Her resignation wasn't framed as a consequence. It was recorded as a transition. That distinction mattered. Authority doesn't always end in spectacle. Sometimes it dissolves into minutes and procedural updates. Later that night, I reread her earlier emails. The formatting was still precise. The language is still confident. Temporary authority. Authorized use. Under review. At the time, those phrases had carried weight. Now they read like artifacts of a role no longer active. The board continued functioning. Meetings resumed. Maintenance schedules posted. But the tone had shifted. Certainty had been replaced with process. Where, once a confident email might have closed discussion, now questions surfaced immediately. Where is that written? Is there documentation? Was there a vote? No one said her name directly anymore. They didn't need to. The lesson had already been absorbed. Authority unexamined expands. Authority documented contracts. Karen never explained her decisions, but she demonstrated something more durable than explanation. Limits exist, and when those limits are crossed, the correction doesn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it comes through paperwork, through silence, through a resignation recorded in a single line. She didn't say goodbye, she didn't defend her position, she didn't contest the findings, she left. And in the quiet that followed, clarity remained. Not closure, not resolution, just understanding. Authority only holds as long as it recognizes where it ends. I didn't move it, not after the inspection, not after the report, not after the resignation. The boat remained tied at the far end of the dock, bow angled slightly northeast, exactly where I had left it before I traveled. For a few days I considered hauling it out, selling it, replacing it with something smaller, less visible, less likely to draw attention. I even ran numbers once, briefly. But every time I walked down the dock and saw it resting there, balanced, secured, unchanged, I let the idea pass. The boat had never made a decision. It hadn't authorized itself. It hadn't issued citations. It hadn't claimed emergency authority. It had simply existed. What had changed was the framework around it. The dock was quiet again. No laminated notices, no enforcement language taped to the railing, just wood planks and open water. Neighbors walked past normally now. No one slowed to ask questions. No one avoided the ramp. The corrections had settled in. Karen was gone. The BIT charter was revised. Enforcement language narrowed. No one used the phrase emergency authority anymore. But something else remained. Awareness. I sat at the edge of the dock one Saturday morning with the registration file in my hands. Not to verify it, not to check expiration dates, just to look at it. A laminated card, a number, my name printed plainly. That had been enough. Not volume, not an argument, not confrontation. Just documentation placed in the right context. The water moved gently against the hull. The boat rocked slightly in place. Still. stable, documented. I didn't unlock the cabin. I didn't start the engine. I left it exactly as it was. Ownership doesn't require display. It requires maintenance. What had happened wasn't dramatic from the outside. No headlines, no legal spectacle, no courtroom. Just a sequence of events corrected by jurisdiction. The dock lights came on automatically at dusk. The boat remained where it belonged. From a distance, nothing distinguished it from any other vessel tied neatly to a slip. That felt appropriate. There's a discipline in not reacting beyond what's necessary, in allowing the record to carry the weight instead of emotion, in leaving something untouched once it has been returned to its rightful place. The boat had been claimed without permission. It had been used under the assumption that authority could substitute for ownership. That assumption had been corrected, not loudly, not aggressively, but permanently. I stood and walked the length of the dock before heading home. The boat stayed, not as a symbol, not as a warning, just as what it had always been, mine.